May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. So I don't know about you, but John really sounds like a bit of a tattletale this morning. He goes running to Jesus. Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. This guy over here, he's casting out demons. Do something about it. He's not one of us. And you wonder sort of what the disciples were really concerned about. I think part of their problem was just prior to this gospel lesson, they had been trying to cast out demons and couldn't. And now there's this guy over here who we don't even know, apparently very successfully casting out demons. I don't know if the disciples are concerned about somehow losing their power or their authority, or they just wanted to make sure that they were the real deal and nobody else was. Because actually at this point in history, there were lots of messiahs wandering around Israel. Jesus wasn't the only Messiah, supposed Messiah. There were lots of self-proclaimed messiahs, and they would gather some followers, and they would stir people up, and then the Romans would grab them and crucify them, and that would be the end of that. So the fact that there was somebody else wandering around supposedly casting out demons would really not have been that surprising. What was surprising is that apparently it was working. And the disciples were none too happy to think that there was somebody else out there, somebody who wasn't us, or somebody who didn't quite believe the way we believed, or didn't follow the path the way we were following it. And Jesus very clearly and calmly says, anybody proclaiming God's name, anybody doing a miracle in my name is obviously part of us, part of the blessed of God. The reason that Mark puts this little story at this point in his gospel is that even though we're only 40 years, maybe 50 years after Jesus' death, even though some of the people in those young Christian communities had probably heard the disciples preach, some of them might have known Paul and heard him preach, or perhaps even heard one of his letters read, even though we're only this far out from Jesus actually having walked on the earth, because they and we are humans, they were already disagreeing about the right way to do things. They were already disagreeing about who was in and who was out, and what rituals did you need to observe, and how should you worship, and what did you believe, and how did you believe it. And so the writer of Mark, seeing this in his community, decided the best way to address it was really to have Jesus address his disciples in the same way. And Mark was saying, not everyone is as holy and blessed as you are. There are people who are still trying to figure this out. There are people who are unsure. That's who Mark's referring to when he says the little ones. He's not necessarily talking about children. He's just talking about people who are new to their faith, who are still trying to figure out who this Jesus guy is, and what does he mean, and how does that change my life. And so Jesus is saying, gather all those people in. You may not think that they're the best, well, they weren't even called Christians yet, the best people on the way. But they're trying. They're faithful. They want to learn about God. They want to hear what you have to say. So don't cast them out. Bring them in. Do what you need to do. Change you so that you can welcome these people. Whatever it is in you that causes you to stumble, figure that out. Be the teachers. Draw them in. Mark was trying to get his community to draw closer together, to recognize that maybe there wasn't one true perfect way to worship. There wasn't one true perfect way to believe. And Jesus was telling his disciples that exact same thing. There's not one true way. Just because somebody isn't necessarily following us and doing things exactly the way we are, doesn't mean that they too are not the beloved of God. That they too do not have power in the Spirit, because clearly they did. They had the ability to cast out demons. And then I think Mark throws in this little tag at the end. Have you ever been in a really long conversation? You've been talking for about an hour and the conversation's about to end and you're about to walk out of the room, and then the most important thing that person had to say, they finally say? So you get this sense that Jesus is talking to his disciples and he's saying, you need to gather in all those who are searching and seeking, all those that want to learn more about me. And he's saying, if your hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. He's sort of wandering. If your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off. If your eye's giving you trouble. And you get the sense Jesus is about this far out the door. And then he says, by the way, be at peace with everyone. And then he turns around and leaves. Be at peace with everyone. It's like this sort of line that just lays out there, and then Jesus goes. And the first time I read the gospel, I read right past it. I was so caught up in the eyes and the hands and the feet and the millstones, and I was like, oh. So then around Thursday, I'm like, oh man, look at what Jesus said now after all the rest. Isn't that what Jesus' point really was? With all that descriptor and all of that teaching. And what was really stunning about it for me this week was just all of the news that happened this week. I'm sure almost all of you had to have seen one clip of the Pope, a video or a picture or something. Maybe you've been following him all week. You've been a Pope groupie. It's okay to be a Pope groupie, and you've read everything that he said, and you've watched all the videos. And what was really extraordinary to me watching him is that every time that guy had the opportunity to jump out of his car, he did. Every time he saw somebody waiting for him, every time somebody, especially a child, wanted a blessing, that guy jumped out of his car. I imagine the Secret Service are going, oh, he's on the move again. Must have been driving them crazy all week long. They could not contain him. And when you watched his face, you watched the Pope address Congress, you watched the Pope address the UN, he had the Pope game face on. He was like, people, I need to tell you these things and you need to pay attention to me. And then he says to the congressional leaders, I'm not having lunch with you, I'm going over here with the homeless folks. And when you watched him walk among the people, his face lit up. When you watched him bless somebody or hold somebody's hand or touch a young person in blessing, you saw this extraordinary face come through. You saw someone who I think strives to be at peace with everyone. Now, I may not agree with everything the Pope still has to say, but I think we saw something extraordinary this week in our own country. We know he's been doing it over there, South America, Europe, wherever he's visited. But this week he was here in our own country, being his own extraordinary self and reaching out to people just like us to share God's grace and God's care in His striving to be at peace. And then we contrast that with the pictures of our congressional leaders at the end of the week. Was there any peace there? I mean, I don't care who you are. I don't care how liberal or conservative or in the middle you are. Our leaders are our leaders. And they were elected to lead our country and to care for our country. And I think part of their job, even though they may not hear it very often, is to strive to be at peace with everyone so that you can serve. Because that's your job, is to serve. And so we saw this extraordinary contrast between someone really serving and clearly his heart and soul in it and the joy on his face, and those whose job is also to serve, and yet such a struggle to try and serve. It was just extraordinary to see these images come across our news, our newspapers, whatever, however you happen to get your news. And then this morning, Jesus says, be at peace with everyone. And it almost felt to me like we heard Jesus saying this supposedly to His disciples 2,000 years ago. And then it was important enough still for Mark, the gospel writer, to continue writing about so that the generations of Christians to come would hear those same words. And here we are in 2015, as desperate for that teaching and those words as those people were then. And that message of Jesus is one that I think needs to rest within us. Because each of us has a place where we need to strive to be at peace, either in ourselves or with someone else, with our wider community, whatever it is. And we saw example of that this week in the gracious way Pope Francis greeted people and welcomed people and was striving to be at peace. And I think he, for us, was this week an icon of what Jesus had to say in striving to be at peace. So, what does that say to you? Where do you need to be at peace with everyone? Where are you finding those places in your lives that are causing you to stumble? That's making life harder than it has to be? That's putting enmity between you and someone else? Where can you strive to remove those stumbling blocks and be at peace with everyone so that the face that we see is one of joy, one of caring, one of compassion, one that shows God's face? Amen.